So I mentioned before that some of the items on my list are literal inventions I've had the idea for. If you want to know what my list is and what this podcast is all about, listen to episode 0. Anyway, some of these inventions are just small things that are kind of simple, but they are on my list, and I figured I'd get the easy stuff out of the way first before I get to some of the bigger items on my list. And even though some of these inventions are very basic, I have put some thought into them, and I think they'd be useful to a lot of people. Besides, the way it's looking, I'll probably never be able to work on any of these things in real life, either because they take too much upfront investment to start, or because they require in-depth knowledge that I don't have. So in order to check them off my list, I'm just going to give those inventions away here. Maybe somebody listening to this can make use of them. The first one up is something I've thought a lot about, on and off. We all know that currently it's hard to prosecute crimes involving sexual harassment and abuse. One of the reasons prosecution is difficult is because it's hard to collect evidence for those crimes. Even in cases where sexual abuse has clearly happened, it's hard to prove it in court because a lot of this activity goes on behind closed doors. There are rape kits, but those can only work in some cases. Well, what if there were an easier way to collect evidence for crimes that occur behind closed doors? This is where my invention comes in. Codename Zena. Essentially, what it would be is a small wearable device made to look like a piece of jewelry or a common object that records audio and doesn't stop when it hears certain auditory triggers. Auditory triggers which you can program into it. Very simple idea. But there are a lot of different features you could build into this thing that would make it extremely useful for both victims and police investigations. The first thing you'd want to do is make it so that these audio files are stored on the device and stored in a different location such as your phone or on a cloud service and can't be tampered with. One thing I know from experience dealing with abusive people is that abusive people will usually try to cover up evidence of their abuse. Well, if the evidence is stored in multiple places and can't be deleted or tampered with in any way, then it's a lot harder to do that. You also want each of these devices to be extremely cheap, so if you lose one, it can be easily replaced. How you would make them both cheap and effective is another question, and would probably require some R&D. You also want to make it so that each device can only be connected to one account, and only the device owner, and possibly sometimes the police, can access that account. You also probably want your device to be able to transmit your location as well, and silently contact the police under certain conditions. For example, you could have 2 different keywords that activate the device. One keyword to record audio, and another keyword to call the police, transmit your location, and record. Activation could even be tied to the user's unique vocal signature, so that only the device owner can actually cause Zena to start recording. There could also be the option of automatically notifying select contacts on your phone if the device has been activated, but this means your device would actually have to be connected to a phone. Beyond that, there are other basic features that would probably be good for these devices to have, such as being waterproof, having an extremely long battery life, recording high-quality audio, being difficult to break, being available in many different styles and form factors, etc. Of course, actually developing a device like this wouldn't necessarily be easy, and would probably require a pretty hefty investment. There are a lot of important questions you'd have to answer as well. For example, when would police be legally allowed to access these recordings? Even if the recordings can't be deleted, where would these audio recordings be stored besides your device? If you're storing them on a cloud service, who would pay to keep that cloud service running, and would they have access to the recordings? Also, how would you actually tell if the device is recording? How would you tell if the battery has run out? Would you be able to recharge these devices, or would you have to get a new one every time the battery runs out? You could make a phone app which performs most of these functions without needing to develop an actual physical recording device. But a phone app is going to have its own set of problems. The first one being that phones are obviously not small and inconspicuous. And even though yes, most people have phones, most people keep their phones in their pockets, which is going to block audio recording quite significantly. And if an abuser gets smart, they can just throw the phone away or break it. And of course, if your phone's battery runs out, the app won't work. Ideally, the battery on a Zena device would last a lot longer than a phone's battery, since phones have to do a lot more than record and store audio. This is why I think Zena would work better as a physical device rather than a phone app. Eventually, you could have a program where Zena devices can be delivered to school addresses or work addresses instead of home addresses, because sometimes the abuser lives at home. You could also have some kind of program that offers Zena account creation and Zena devices for users who don't have phones or computers or easy internet access. I understand that a lot of this sounds more like a wish list of features rather than an in-depth analysis of how this device and these programs would actually work. And yeah, that's true. But the reality is, I can't tell you exactly how all this would work, because developing something like this is simply going to require a lot of trial and error. Maybe some of these features won't be possible, or will be limited by other features. Maybe the audio recording aspect will be the most difficult thing to pin down. Without being able to test this, I can't tell you what features will be possible and what won't. I don't even know if it's possible to make something like this cheaply. Now, in recent years, I did discover something that's kind of similar to Zena, called Invisaware, but there are some pretty big differences between Invisaware and the thing I've been talking about. First off, Invisaware is not a recording device. It's basically a panic button. It's a semi-discrete wearable device that can transmit your location and call the police on your behalf if you press the button on it or if you say the right keyword. But it doesn't record audio, and thus it can't be used for evidence. Also, the devices themselves are pretty expensive. The cheapest one I'm looking at right now is $99, but some of them are upwards of $200, and they're not rechargeable, so when the battery runs out, you've got to buy a new one. There's also an extra subscription service on top of that. For $19.99 a month, you can get professional monitoring. Not exactly sure what that entails, but it sounds like more fees. What I envision for Zena is something that's a lot less expensive and a lot more useful in the courtroom. The only thing I'd be concerned with is that if Zena devices were to become widely used, there will be people who try to take advantage of them. For example, a hacker might find a way to activate Zena devices wirelessly and listen in on what someone is doing without them noticing. Or maybe if certain people in government had unlimited backdoor access to these devices, they'd be able to use that information in malicious ways. Sure, some people believe that our government is generally trustworthy and wouldn't do something like that for the most part. But even if the people in our government are generally trustworthy now, that may not always be the case. I think it makes sense to be at least somewhat concerned with this. Anyway, just a small idea. The next few ideas are going to seem like very basic inventions that pretty much anyone could think of, and, well, they kind of are. But I think many people would appreciate these basic ideas if you could actually come up with a smart way of doing them. Ergonomic controllers. Okay, hear me out. I've been a gamer pretty much my whole life. I love video games. But as I've gotten older, I've noticed, as maybe others have, that it can be hard on the joints, especially if the games you like to play are button mashy, quick reaction kind of games. Now, I've definitely seen keyboards and mice that are made to be ergonomic, but I've never seen controllers which were made with the express purpose of being ergonomic. I've had the thought that maybe it'd be possible to develop controllers for older gamers that are a little less tough on the joints and that are compatible with a range of disabilities. The market on this probably wouldn't be huge, but it'd be there. This is something I would definitely invest in. A lot of the joint issues I've had seem to stem from the fact that your fingers are basically slamming down on a hard surface over and over again. But if something is there to absorb most of the impact of a press, or if there isn't much of an impact to begin with, you should be able to reduce the overtime damage done to your joints. There are a couple ways you can do this. You could make padded buttons, possibly with some sort of material underneath each button. You could even try making the buttons themselves from a different material. You could also have something like springs built into each button so that the force required to press the button increases the further you press down, which reduces the actual impact when your fingers get to the bottom. What you're ultimately trying to do is reduce the shock effect that comes from a hard stop on a surface, but the idea is to make controllers that will reduce the impact on your joints. Of course, button presses are not the only issue. Some people have hands that aren't quite shaped in a way that fits a basic controller scheme. So you could have a way of customizing the shape, size, and layout of controllers to fit the needs of these people. Now there could be a company that already does all this. I don't know. I just thought it'd be an interesting idea. The next invention idea on the list is microwaves that make things cold. I get it, it sounds dumb, but seriously, why don't we have these yet? You might think, well, you have the fridge and the freezer, but that's not the point. Technically, if you want to heat something up, you can use an oven. But why do people use microwaves? Because microwaves heat things up faster than an oven. Yes, it's true that you can put something in the fridge or freezer to cool it down, but both of those take a while, depending on what you're trying to cool. For example, putting a can of soda in the fridge can take a couple hours to cool it to a temperature you want. Putting it in the freezer takes less time, but it's still a bit of a wait, and if you leave it in there too long, it can cause the soda to burst, which is probably not ideal. Now I get that there are real-world physics problems you'd have to solve to make something like this. The reason why microwaves can make things hot quickly is literally because they use tiny little waves of electromagnetic radiation. But cooling something down is a different problem altogether. It's not exactly like you can just reverse those radiation waves and magically make something cold. That's not how it works. If you wanted to make something cold quickly, you'd probably have to come up with a different system, maybe a system involving chemistry rather than radiation. So really, a microwave that makes things cold probably couldn't even be called a microwave, depending on how that cooling happens. Now, my guess is people probably have tried to make something like this in the past. It just seems like too obvious of an idea for someone not to have tried. But I have no clue who did that, or how they did that, or why it failed. I don't know. But I'd also probably guess that modern technological advances make this invention more feasible than ever. Or maybe not. Maybe microwaves that make things cold are literally a physical impossibility. But if they are impossible, I'm genuinely curious to know why they're impossible. Maybe one of these fancy science tubers like Kyle Hill can answer this one for me. I mean, there is a market for an invention like this. Anyway, whatever, on to the next idea. The last idea I'm going to discuss in this episode is something that, again, is really easy to talk about, but would probably be much harder to accomplish. And that's manned drones. In recent years, remote-controlled drones have become pretty popular as handheld items, and are now being used for a wide variety of applications, including military applications. Well, I've always thought it would be cool to build a manned drone that you can get in and fly around in. We already have the basic framework for how drones operate. Why couldn't you just make them larger and put people in them? Yes, we do have helicopters, but helicopters are big, clunky, very expensive, require lots of training and legalities you have to comply with, and are very complicated to use. Unless you know how to fly one, you can't just get in and drive. A helicopter is a big mess of a machine. What I'm envisioning is more like a car or a motorcycle in drone form. Something that's made for personal use, which is simple and intuitive to drive, but that has lots of safety systems built into it. Because safety is probably the first and last thing people would be concerned with when it comes to an invention like this. The truth is, there probably are people currently working on manned drones. It's possible that certain organizations already have them, they're just not commercially available. I know I've seen at least one article showing how someone invented a motorcycle that converts into a drone. But there are a couple issues I have with that particular variation. Yeah, I mean it looks cool, but are you ever really going to need a motorcycle that's also a drone? Why not just make the drone part and focus your efforts on perfecting that? Also, there's a video of it flying and it just seems very slow. If you can find it, you can see what I'm talking about. And of course, a system like this seems very prone to safety issues because there are so many moving parts. I know it sounds like I'm trashing it. I do think it's pretty cool that someone went and accomplished that, but I also can't help but to think there are real concerns and issues with it. Now, my guess is, when you're building any kind of vehicle that flies, that a person can get into, you're gonna have to put up with a lot of bureaucracy and legalities. Aeronautics is not something you simply get into, like art or fashion. There are lots of laws and regulations you'd probably have to deal with when developing something like this. It would also probably be very costly just to get a hold of the materials you'd use for testing. Not to mention the fact that you're going to need a whole team of very solid engineers to work on the various systems of the thing. There are probably only a small number of people and organizations in the world that actually have the money, resources, and engineers that could build something like this and make it viable. I know I have my own ideas about the various systems that a manned drone could utilize to make it safer, faster, and more economic. For example, if the battery in your drone suddenly dies while you're in the air and you start falling out of the sky, well, a drone that's simply falling down has some amount of kinetic energy. I've thought that maybe it would be possible to use that energy as a way of powering a separate failsafe sort of system, a system which can spin the rotors just enough to float you to the ground. You could also probably construct the drone in such a way that if it starts falling, the wind resistance from the fall can be used as a way of setting the drone upright, rather than tumbling and spinning. But again, my ideas are purely speculative, and chances are I'll never be able to test any of these things out. So those are the 4 ideas I'm going to talk about today. I still have a few more invention ideas on my list, but they're a lot bigger and more in-depth than these ones, so I'm probably going to give each of them their own episode. If you're listening to this on YouTube, please leave a like and a comment. If you're listening to this on Spotify, remember to subscribe and share. You know the deal. I'm not sure what the next episode is going to be about yet because I'm still going through my list and organizing, but it's probably going to be something more psychology or philosophy related. Anyway, that's it for now. And remember, an apple a day does not keep the doctor away if it's filled with poison.